In Psalm 11 and verse 3, we read, "If the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do?" During the course of this study, we have seen how in America we have moved from that biblical American view of law and government that's contained in the documents of our founding. But what's operative today is a pagan view of law and government. It's our intent and hope that in this lecture, Lecture 11, you're going to be able to appreciate the broad sweep of historical events and influences that have altered the way in which Americans think about truth and about law and government. With Lecture 11, here's Jake McCauley.
The crisis of the Constitution, from biblical absolutes to humanistic relativism. How did we get there? The framers' view of the Constitution was that law, like truth, is unchanging. It's a fixed standard, and it was given by God. This is derived partly from the biblical view of truth. In the New Testament, truth is identified with Jesus Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Christ said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." They derive their view also partly from Sir Isaac Newton, who taught that the universe is governed by fixed, absolute, God-ordained laws. Scientific laws like the law of motion, gravity, mathematics, chemistry, physics. Moral laws for the governance of man. This is Isaac Newton. I was always taught he was more of a secularist or a secular figure. He was not. He's a very devout Christian man. His views were eagerly embraced by Christians and deists alike. These were the views of the laws of nature and nature's God. Our founders also derived their view of truth in part from the legal and political thinkers like Blackstone, Montesquieu, and Locke, who we've covered in the past, who taught that man's law must conform to the revealed law of God, the Bible, Scripture, or the laws of nature, both of which were dictated and directed by God Himself. The framers therefore believed that the Constitution was to be interpreted according to a fixed standard, just as truth is fixed. Its plain meaning is to be interpreted by the intent of those who drafted the document and those who ratified it. Now, this is called the jurisprudence of original intent. The meaning of the word jurisprudence meaning studying or theory of law. Madison said, "If the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation be not the guide in expounding it, there can be no security for a faithful exercise of its powers." Jefferson also stated, "The Constitution on which our Union rests shall be administered by me according to the safe and honest meaning contemplated by the plain understanding of the people of the United States at the time of its adoption." Original intent. Washington said, "If, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be at any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation, though this may in one instance be the instrument of good. It is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed." Now we come to a changing view of truth, which I think is what most of us in society in this day and age are used to observing. We can trace this back to the 1700s. Truth was under attack then by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He rejected the concept of sin. Sin didn't exist. It wasn't bad. Sinfulness was not bad. He stressed the goodness of man and said that the reason that so much evil is happening in the world is because of human institutions, which is a contradiction of terms because if humans aren't good, and he stressed the goodness of humans, who populates these human institutions? Well, humans do. So how do they get bad if only good people are in them? It makes no sense. But neither will the rest of these thinkers as we talk about them, as we contemplate what they taught and their philosophy. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, he rejected the concept of absolute unchanging truth. He took Rousseau and brought it to a new level. He believed that truth evolves from age to age. And this means by which truth changes is called the dialectic. You have a thesis, which is your truth. You have an antithesis, which then attacks that truth with a new truth. And then the two come up with a compromise, and we call that a synthesis, or a new synthesis, a new truth. You saw this happening when in play, specifically between Democrats and Republicans, with health care and the health care bill 3200. It's an example of this dialectic. You see, you have the liberal progressives that come and attack the Constitution with an antithesis and say the government should be involved in health care. And you have the Republicans counteract that with, instead of taking the thesis and standing upon that, they come and create a new synthesis to accommodate and appease. But we have to understand that the new synthesis and the antithesis are of the same philosophy. They both change what truth is, the thesis, which is where we started. And this is how truth and law evolve, according to Hegel. Well, then we have Auguste Comte, and he was the father of positivism. This is later on, closer to the beginning of the 1800s. In this concept of positivism, the only meaningful truth is that which can be empirically verified, so we can see this through our observation or our experience. That's the only type of truth that really exists. This renders concepts such as God, as an example, or the divine law, or God-given rights, or natural law, or equality, or human dignity. These are meaningless. You can't empirically verify these things. They may exist, but you can't verify them. Charles Darwin then, in the 1800s, comes along and he popularized an evolutionary model of origins through his Origin of Species book. This starts out with overproduction, so example, overpopulation, and then you have a struggle for survival. And the survival, of course, is going to go to the fittest one, the one with the longest legs, or the one with the biggest muscles, or the smartest one. And then, after those survivors, those fit people have survived, now you have a reproduction of like kinds. So now we get better, we evolve better because the strongest have survived, and they're going to, of course, repopulate. And the cycle continues, and we get better and better and better. That was his theory. I haven't found that to be true in human nature at all. He did not develop this model into a philosophical worldview. Actually, others did. We give him credit for far more of this concept than we should. But many people like Herbert Spencer, who has been coined the Darwin Bulldog, came and brought Darwin's model of philosophy to an actual worldview. He wrote extensively showing how evolution is the unifying principle affecting and underlying every academic discipline. His economics were more laissez-faire, without any reference to God, social Darwinism. This was a tooth-and-claw, cutthroat competition. It's unlike biblical capitalism, which also stresses compassion and moral responsibility. Biblical capitalism is expressed in the Proverbs 31 woman, who works with her hands, sells what she makes, then buys food for her family. She has enough left over to buy a field, plants a vineyard in it, and then makes more money and gives it to the poor. Crony capitalism and laissez-faire are perverted forms of biblical capitalism. The first one, the government gives preference to one business over another, usually as payback for political support or special favors for family members. The second can sometimes make it overly difficult for small companies to start up. So of course this Darwinism then crept into economics. It then also crept into psychology. We see that through Freud and Jungian psychology. We also have it creeping into sociology and anthropology, and then finally even liberal biblical criticisms, viewing the Bible as an evolving document, developing as a man evolved, rather than revelation given by God to man that was fixed and unchanging. So we actually are God evolving the Bible now. And then comes the rise of legal positivism, and I want to talk about the Dean of Harvard, Christopher Columbus Langdell. He, of course, was of Harvard Law School, and he pioneered a new theory of law known as legal positivism. This was replacing the natural law theory. Two of his notable disciples were Roscoe Pound and Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., a name that you may recognize. The principle of legal positivism was this: there are no divine absolutes in law, or if there is, they're irrelevant to the modern legal system. That old stuff that your grandparents depended upon, your parents depended, that's old, that's gone, that's done. We've got a new way of thinking. Law is simply man-made. In other words, whatever the state says. Because see, man may make it, but it has to be the strongest man. Who is the strongest man? Well, if we've eliminated God out of the equation, the strongest man becomes the government system. They have the weapons, they have the muscle, and they have the wealth. And law evolves as man evolves. Well, who could we put as the strongest men in this government system? Well, this would be the judges. The judges guide the evolution of law by writing decisions. And to study law the scientific way, you have to get to the original sources. You have to study the decisions of judges, not the Constitution. This is the case law method of legal study. And we have a DVD that our founder, Michael Perutka, dedicates specifically to this case law method that has replaced law and truth and the Constitution. The result is a living Constitution. Of course, it's living, it evolves itself. The view the judges are not bound by the intent of the framers, but they're rather free to give new meanings to the Constitution. Some legal scholars have even called the court a continuing constitutional convention. Judges who hold this view feel free to create new rights not found in the Constitution. These rights could include rights like abortion or homosexual conduct. And remember, God gave us rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And He created law to protect those rights. The purpose law exists, as is the purpose of government's existence, is to protect your God-given rights. He wanted to give you life, the right to life. Therefore, He said, thou shalt not kill. He wanted to give you property. Therefore, He said, thou shalt not steal. Radical offshoots of legal positivism include legal realism. This argues that since there's no divine or absolute natural law principles that exist, then why not just scrap this legal system and quit trying to pretend they do exist and just favor, don't be neutral, favor the cause that you want to favor. Well, there's no security for anybody's rights there because it depends who's in power and what their philosophical views are. There's also the critical legal studies movement. This is often Marxist, and this argues that, well, the weak among us should be favored, the poor should be favored, and we should work against strong institutions, religious institutions, the wealthy. So this creates the class warfare of the haves against the have-nots. It should be more difficult for those that are wealthy. They should have less rights and less freedoms. But God states in Leviticus 19:15, this blew my mind when I first read this because of the way that I was trained. I was trained to think that the justice system should favor the poor. But God says, you shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. Now listen to where He starts. You shall not respect the person of the poor, nor the person of the mighty. But in righteousness shalt thou judge thy neighbor. So it's the righteous standard. What is truth? What is law? That's the standard that we judge by. To give an example of this evolutionary law method and how it's changed law in America, well, it hasn't really changed law, but it's the concept or the vehicle by which people have tried to change law. Furman versus Georgia, Justice Brennan and Marshall argued that capital punishment is cruel and unusual punishment. Capital punishment. It's of course condoned in the Fifth Amendment. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. In other words, if due process finds you guilty, you can lose your life, liberty, or property. So our founders did not believe that that was cruel or unusual. They thought that murder was cruel and unusual, therefore they had a capital punishment. But these two justices argued that the cruel and unusual punishment, which was barred by the Eighth Amendment, applied to the death penalty. Although the framers clearly didn't intend that, Brennan and Marshall said the amendment must draw its meaning from the evolving standards of decency that marks the progress of a maturing society. So they've totally changed the Constitution by making that statement. The dangers of a living constitutional approach are, number one, your rights are not secure. If this thing is evolving, we don't know where it's evolving to, and if the judges are guiding that evolutionary process, judges die. So we can never get our handles on this. The same court that can read into the Constitution rights that aren't there, i.e. abortion, again, or homosexual conduct, can read out of the Constitution rights that really do exist, like property rights, contract rights, firearms, and free exercise of religion. So there is no security here. There's no guarantee that history will always move upward and keep getting better. We've seen in the 20th century, this was the bloodiest century that ever existed. Why? Because governments turned on their own people. They eliminated truth and put themselves in that role to dictate what truth is, in that role of God. The fixed standard of the Constitution is a far better guarantee of human rights than any evolving judge or man-made guarantee can give us. We need to hold within that. It leads to big government as well. Government will never limit its own powers. You see through strained interpretations of the General Welfare Clause, the Interstate Commerce Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, the Contract Clause, the Due Process Clause. The courts have opened the door to a vast expansion of the size and scope of government at all levels. And I want to give you some examples. These are found in your notebook. In 1789, the federal government under President Washington had 350 federal employees. Today they number in the millions. Well, we have more populace. We don't have even close to the population expansion that the government has experienced. In 1832, the total federal budget was $11 million. Now we're in multiple trillions of dollars. This means for every dollar spent by the federal government in 1832, in 2015, the government spent well over $1 million. The reality of the debt impact on individuals is staggering. In 1832, that was roughly $1.30 per person, with a population of roughly 13 million. Now in 2015, with a population of over 320 million, that has climbed to a horrendous $53,125 per person. Since 1900, the total number of government laws and regulations the average citizen is required to obey has increased over 3,000%. The increase of government control and government services leads to a corresponding decrease in what? Control for the government increases, our rights and our liberties decrease. And so does our individual responsibility. We no longer have to act for ourselves because the government is doing that. We no longer have to control our conduct because the government's doing that. Now we can be an alcoholic. Now we can be overweight. We can get government subsidies to help treat us. We become a victim now, and the government will take care of us. Unfortunately, the way it's taking care of us is destroying. It's desecrating our human dignity, first of all, and it's destroying our rights and our liberties right in front of us. If the state is the highest authority, and then there's no higher law, and if there is no such thing as higher law other than the state, then there's no such thing as an unjust law coming from the state. We don't have a standard to measure it against and to call them out. This leads to judicial tyranny. Now, I've got a list in your student notebook of different justices. For instance, Hamilton argued the judiciary is the least dangerous branch of government because its job, its powers, are limited to interpreting the Constitution and laws. In other words, applying them, just like a referee. He takes the rules and he applies them to both teams. He can't pick a team. He can't create new rules. His job is to be a referee. He's very essential, but he's non-powerful. He merely makes the call. The power lies in the rules and the lawmaking body itself, which is our legislature. And those laws can't contradict. They cannot be suffered to contradict. As William Blackstone said, the laws of nature and nature's God. Justice Felix Frankfurter said, what governs is the Constitution and not what we say about it. It's not our opinion. It's not a judge's opinion. William Rehnquist, who was a former Chief Justice, said, no amount of repetition of historical errors in judicial opinions can make the errors true. He's reiterating or confirming what Frankfurter said by saying that, listen, we screw it up, but what we screw up and what we say does not make truth. Truth makes truth. If judges aren't bound by the fixed standards and the plain meaning of the Constitution or the intent of the framers, again, that's important, they're free, in the words of Chancellor James Kent, to roam at large in the trackless fields of their own imaginations. Lino Graglia, a professor of constitutional law at the University of Texas School of Law, stated that judicial usurpation of legislative power has become so common and so complete that the Supreme Court has become our most powerful and important instrument of government in terms of determining the nature and quality of American life. Constitutional law has become a fraud, a cover for a system of government by the majority vote of a 9-person committee of lawyers, unelected, and holding office for life. Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes said, we are under a Constitution, but the Constitution is what the judges say it is. Do you see how law is evolving now? I want to take a discourse between Humpty Dumpty and Alice in Lewis Carroll's book, Through the Looking Glass.
When I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean. Neither more nor less.
The question is whether you can make words mean so many different things.
The question is, which is to be master? That's all.
If we're to give over the meaning of words to a ruling elite, then they will become God. And if they become God, then there is absolutely no security. This whole thing collapses. We've moved from a biblical view of government to a pagan view of government, and when that happens, we will be destroyed. We'll be destroyed at our own demise. The answer and the solution is to get back to the basics. Get back to the Constitution as it's been interpreted by our framers, and get back to the biblical principles that our framers held. Because if we don't get back to biblical principles that our founders held, we'll be as the founder of Pennsylvania, William Penn, stated, "Those who will not be governed by God will be ruled by tyrants." I hope you've enjoyed this lecture 11 from our United States Constitution class, and we look forward to you joining us for a lecture 12. Thank you very much.